Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Shari Markson. Tonight, a stunning development on our exclusive story on secret recordings of Brittany Higgins' lawyer. That coming up in a moment. Also tonight, people in far north Queensland are preparing to evacuate as Cyclone Jasper heads towards land. Stephen Miles will become Queensland's next Premier after his rival pulled out of the race. Does this mean the unions are now running the show? Jenna Clark will join me to discuss. Albanese's Communications Minister is set to be granted secret powers to combat so-called misinformation. Powers that have free speech champions very worried. We'll get stuck into this with Paul Murray and Liz Storer shortly. And the treatment of hostages under Hamas is unlike anything Israeli doctors have seen. Beatings, sexual assaults, brandings, not to mention how they were drugged before being released. I'll analyse this with Israeli politician Sharon Haskell a bit later. But first, today a judge ordered Sky News hand over the secret recordings we obtained of Brittany Higgins' lawyer discussing her testimony with fiancé David Shiraz the night before she returned to the witness box for cross-examination in a high-profile defamation trial. This related to our report at the start of this program last night, where we broadcast the sensational recording of Leon Zweier giving suggestions on how Brittany Higgins should answer tough questions during her cross-examination, including about the Commonwealth's $2.4 million compensation payment in the ongoing trial in the federal court in Sydney. Bruce Lerman's lawyers today asked Justice Michael Lee to subpoena our recordings and transcripts from last night's program, and the judge did so with our lawyers handing over the material this afternoon. Lawyers for Lerman, Ten and Lisa Wilkinson will now be able to hear the entire conversation and decide whether they think it's relevant to the issues in the case and should form part of the evidence. The audio recording was made at the Park Hyatt Hotel lobby bar last Monday, the 4th of December, the night before Higgins returned to cross-examination in the defamation case brought by Bruce Lerman against Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson. Today, Justice Lee read from the Listening Devices Surveillance Act, and he said that the relevant issue seems to be the definition of a private conversation. He said while there's a prohibition on using any device to record a private conversation, it does not include a conversation made in any circumstances in which the parties to it ought reasonably to expect that it might be overheard by someone else. Justice Lee said it's certainly arguable that the audio recording would not fall within a definition of a private conversation under the Act. And that was our view, that the recording was made in a public bar by an unrelated party who happened to be there. The witness, who has no connection to the case, could hear their conversation very clearly. The group was speaking loudly and made no effort to keep their conversation private. Leon Zweier is a well-known and highly respected Melbourne lawyer, known as Mr. Fix-It. He's from the prestigious firm Arnold Bloch Leibler. He's represented a string of high-profile clients, including Daniel Andrews, Bill Shorten, and the late billionaire Richard Pratt. David Shiraz and Brittany Higgins have both shared photos with Zweier on their social media. In one post, Higgins dubs him Australia's best lawyer. Both Leon Zweier and David Shiraz are easily recognisable figures to anyone who closely follows the news. Justice Lee today said that he wouldn't press Lerman's barrister Stephen Whybrow to divulge whatever application he proposes to make in relation to our recordings of Zweier, but he said he would like to know by tomorrow morning if it's going to be a significant line of inquiry. Lisa Wilkinson's barrister Sue Chrysanthu told the court she had no objection to the subpoena being issued and possibly no issue at all with the material being tendered. Now, as I mentioned, this all follows our exclusive report last night where we revealed that Zweier met with Higgins' fiancé David Shiraz the night before her testimony last Tuesday and offered advice on what Higgins should tell the judge under oath the next morning. If Zwaya's advice was communicated to Higgins, it would be a potential contempt of court in defiance of a federal court judge. Witnesses should not receive coaching during their period of cross-examination. This is a rule reiterated by Justice Lee during the trial. We're not suggesting that Zwaya intended his advice to be passed on to Higgins. There's no evidence that Shiraz did so. And Higgins told the court last week she hadn't received advice from anyone in regards to her testimony. Zwaya also told us yesterday he didn't intend for his advice to be communicated to Higgins. He said, "All my private conversations with David Shiraz and Emma Webster were on the common understanding that Brittany was under cross-examination and no one was to talk with her about the substance of her evidence or the manner in which she was giving it." But Zwaya is captured in the recording and was overheard by witnesses discussing with Shiraz how she should respond when questioned about her Commonwealth Government settlement and inconsistencies in her story. In one recording, Zwaya suggests Higgins should cite legal privilege when asked whether she sought legal advice before making public comments after the collapse of the criminal trial.
If he's asking you legal advice about something, yes, what was the advice? You should say privilege. You know, Your Honour, I'm told by my lawyer, that's what she should say. I've been told by my lawyer, I don't need to discuss the legal advice.
As you heard then, Zwaya suggested to Shiraz that Higgins say, "Your Honour, I'm told by my lawyer I don't have to discuss legal advice." Well, Shiraz then asked, well, if the judge rules out that line of questioning about her comments on the courthouse steps and whether they were intended to scuttle a retrial, then what else will he ask about? Zwaya said that Higgins may be asked about the Commonwealth settlement, which we now know is $2.4 million. And Zwaya says to be very wary around these questions.
Let's say the judge rules out that one. It's not all that. Everything else, what's he give up to? He goes to book inconsistencies, he goes to the be very wary in terms of confidential. Which is talk about because it's confidential. The judge said that which might say it's legal advice. Just tell the truth. The minute she goes into that thinking in public consent, and go on testify. It's all irrelevant.
Zwaya was also captured on tape suggesting to Shiraz that Higgins should cite legal professional privilege on the stand and also could say that it's not about the money.
She doesn't have the way of legal professionals. She's the same. Just so enraged when I read it. So enraged. So whether it be well enough or not well enough. It was just a gut reaction. It's not about money. She should just say it was. She doesn't ever have the way of legal advice. It's legal advice.
At another point in their conversation, Zwaya told Shiraz that Higgins should keep her answers short, particularly if she's asked questions about making money from her story. Shiraz and Zwaya also discuss whether the judge understands Higgins. They talk about how she's an unemotional witness unless speaking about the rape allegation. And they refer to criticism that she turned her rape allegation into a multimedia story, saying that this criticism is belittling.
So when it gets back to the rape, what is it the judge doesn't like about it? You can tell, I can tell. No, but what she did for a reason. To convert it to a media story. It's so deliberate. What she does is she just associates herself with the rape, which is turns into a multimedia kind of stupid part. She does, and so it's not. She's not true. She's not sobbing. She's not crying. But when she talks about the actual rape she made, Surely he can see that. But when he's the consequences so deliberate. Well, what's deliberate? Because if she's going to blow up her life, shameless Parliament, she wanted to make sure of that.
And in a revelation that will shock the public, Zweier said that he, and not a doctor, drafted Higgins' medical report, which detailed her anxiety and suicide attempt. He read aloud the medical report to the group after opening his laptop at the bar. He said, "Let me brief you," before reading a statement from the doctors that he received on the 9th of October. For privacy reasons, we've edited out the part where Zweier read aloud Higgins' medical records.
Let me read you. First, so the first it's like my statement. It was from the doctors on the 9th of October. On the Saturday night, on Sunday morning, I got a script on the doctor. Very specific from you. Give me the Yeah, I gave him a draft. It's what I wrote.
The medical report was used when the ACT Director of Public Prosecutions, Shane Drumgold, announced he wouldn't proceed with a retrial of the rape charges against Lerman because of Higgins' fragile mental health. 10 days later, a one-day mediation took place between Higgins and the Commonwealth, which led to a deed of settlement where Higgins was paid $2.4 million. Zweier didn't respond to our questions about whether this medical report that he claimed he drafted was also submitted to the Commonwealth. But Zweier is likely to face scrutiny over his claim that he drafted this medical report. Firstly, was Shane Drumgold aware that Zweier had drafted it? And if he wasn't aware, would it have made any difference to his decision to call off the criminal retrial? There could be inquiries about which doctor signed off on this report and whether the medical practitioner agreed with it and why he allowed a lawyer to draft it in the first place, and was he aware? Also, was it presented to the mediation with the federal government? Was the Commonwealth government told that the medical report had been drafted by Higgins' lawyer, if indeed it was presented to them? And if they weren't told, it raises questions about the multi-million-dollar payout. The Australian's legal contributor Chris Merritt says that the ACT Attorney General has an interest in this affair as well. Chris Merritt says, was this document the only reason that Bruce Lerman was denied criminal justice in the ACT? If it was, its status needs to be examined thoroughly. He says the ACT government is now on notice that this critically important document was not drafted by a doctor but by a lawyer acting for Brittany Higgins. Did the doctor agree with all of this? Who is this doctor? And he needs to be asked why he allowed his name and office to be used in this way. Were he and Drumgold aware? Chris Merritt says this all goes to why Bruce Lerman was denied his day in court. It is inescapable that the genesis of the medical report needs to be examined in the wake of these recordings. Now, there were more developments in the defamation trial today, and later in the show, we'll hear from Sky News reporter Julia Bradley about how this unfolded in court today, also what the project's producer had to say about the photograph of a bruise on Brittany Higgins' leg. He was asked why he thought this photograph survived Higgins' phone when so much other content was lost or deleted. So we're going to come back to that a bit later in the show. But now Stephen Miles will be the next Premier of Queensland after Health Minister Shannon Fentiman withdrew her candidacy. Stephen Miles says his focus is on the people of Queensland.
Absolutely focused on them, their safety, their cost of living and the issues that are important to them.
But opposition leader federally Peter Dutton today said that the Premier in waiting will be more focused and owned by the unions.
I saw a comment yesterday from somebody in the Labor caucus who rightly pointed out that if Stephen Miles becomes Premier, which obviously now he will be completely and utterly owned by Mr Bullock and the union movement. And that is not what Queensland has voted for.
All right, let's bring in now Associate Editor of The Australian, Jenna Clark, to talk us through this and the rest of the day's top stories. Great to see you, Jenna. Look, what do we know about Stephen Miles, the new Premier of Queensland, and what do you make of the accusations that, in effect, he's a puppet for the unions?
Yeah, Shari, I think Mr Dutton's pretty much bang on. Rather than just beholden to the unions, he's also pretty much just Anastasia Palaszczuk in a suit, because this is not renewal. This is just the exact same thing that we're going to get for the next couple of months as we head into campaign mode, because he's just reiterating exactly what Premier Palaszczuk was saying. I'm going to look after your safety. I'm going to make sure your cost of living is coming down, when in reality, they're not really doing a lot about it, because youth crime, as we know, is out of control in that state, and the health system is absolutely cooked, which is interesting why someone like Shannon Fentiman has decided to pull out of the race. And I think it's pretty smart. She's probably going to let Miles take this hit at the election because of, I think, my personal opinion is that David Christodoulou, the LNP leader, has done a great job and will probably romp this home for the LNP come next year.
Look, let's have a look at how the Albanese government's tracking as the year comes to a close. Albanese on holidays again this week. Well, not again, but he's on leave. He's on holidays this week. It's yet another week that he's not focused on Australia and domestic politics. The Australian's political editor, Simon Benson, says that there's a perception that's now set in that with no action being taken on the cost of living, this is now hurting the government politically. Simon Benson writes that the Treasurer needs a new economic narrative in his mid-year budget update. This all, of course, as we're seeing rising costs of living, higher interest rates. This is clearly the main concern for Australians. And Jenna, do you think Simon's right that the perception is the government's just not doing enough to deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's bang on the fact that Jim Chalmers likes to talk a lot about the economy rather than actually doing things about the economy. Maybe less time doing good weekend features and writing 6,000-word opuses for the monthly magazine about what you intend to do and your grand plan, and actually put something into practice. And I think the proof will definitely be in the pudding when the mid-year budget comes out tomorrow.
Look, Jim Chalmers is also saying that high immigration isn't responsible for our inflation levels. This is despite 500,000 people migrating to Australia in the last financial year. Peter Dutton says this claim is a lie. Have a look.
How does Jim Chalmers look the Australian public in the eye and tell them a story about migration which is not true? The pressure that they're putting onto housing is going to make it less affordable for families to get a home. It's going to make it less affordable for somebody to rent a property. And I think Australians realise that this government's made decisions that are just making it harder for families.
Jenna, I mean, clearly the high immigration intake has been, not solely to blame, but it has certainly been a contributing factor for inflation staying high when you look, as Peter Dutton says, at the pressure that it's put on the rental market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most of those people in Cabinet should probably get outside the Qantas Chairman's Lounge and actually go and talk to everyday Australians that are struggling to either find a rental, pay their rent, or probably suffering from severe mortgage stress at this point in time, because that is very real outside. And I think Mr Chalmers is right, it's not all about migration, it's just a part of the story. But it is a severe factor that the infrastructure in this country is not up to standard.
Look, Peter Dutton in that press conference today, he was on fire, he was blasting everyone, and he had a go at Australia's High Commissioner to the UK, Stephen Smith, former Labor Minister. He said that he should be ashamed of his decision to cancel a key Australia Day event in London next year, and he said that the government needed to intervene on this matter. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely disgusting that someone like that is now freelancing overseas. This is a really important day to many Australians. And sure, we can always talk about whether we change the date, but again, that's a decision for the federal government to make. So the fact that this former minister has taken it upon himself to make this decision, I think, is appalling. And the fact that there has been no response from the government about this just adds to that anger that I think a lot in the community are feeling.
All right, Jenna Clark, thank you so much for your time. And coming up, Labor frontbencher Ed Husic complains that doctors, actors and journalists should be able to campaign against Israel, the Jewish homeland, without facing any consequences. He ignores the fact that this movement is targeting Australian Jews, a problem his own government has done nothing to address. Liz Storer and Paul Murray will join me to call out this one-sided nonsense in a moment. If you're just tuning in, here are the top stories you need to know. Sky News has been subpoenaed over the secret recording of Brittany Higgins' lawyer speaking with her fiancé, David Shiraz. These were the tapes I played you last night. Stephen Miles will become the next Queensland Premier on Friday after Health Minister Shannon Fentiman withdrew from the race. Shannon Fentiman, I should say. Tropical cyclone Jasper could bring heavy rain and winds of up to 90 kilometres per hour overnight as it moves towards the North Queensland coast. China has lifted sanctions from 3 Australian abattoirs in a further easing of trade barriers. And one person is fighting for life, another 19 rushed to hospital after 30 cars crashed on a freeway west of Melbourne. Well, Labor frontbencher Ed Husic says that Australian actors, journalists and doctors should be able to campaign against Israel without facing any retribution. Joe Kelly.
If people express a view and have the decency to show heart in relation to what's happening in Gaza and calling out the need to recognise humanity are then effectively professionally blacklisted, I don't think that's right. I think people should be able to express their concern and stand with humanity and say that they have they are very concerned about what they're seeing in Gaza, and they shouldn't have to face professional retribution as a response.
Don't you love how people turn humanity, something that's actually aggression against Jews, into humanity? That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing serious intimidation of the Jewish community. Ed Husic here complaining that Sydney Theatre Company actors should be allowed to protest on stage, intimidate Jewish audiences. He says doctors should be able to join a petition against Israel's action in Gaza without any consequences at all. And you know all those journalists who signed the petition that said Israel should be treated with the same scepticism as Hamas, a terror group. Well, Ed Husic is outraged that they've been taken off writing stories about the war over at the Sydney Morning Herald. He wants there to be biased reporting of the war in the media. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry co-CEO Alex Rifchin told Joe Kelly in The Australian that Ed Husic should pause and think how a Jewish audience member would feel when a performer comes out wearing the same scarf donned by people who just massacred, raped and abducted Jews on a horrific scale. Alex said that rather than engaging in ugly gesture politics intended to divide our society and make Jewish performers and audiences feel excluded, these artists should donate their earnings to credible aid agencies working for genuine peace. Instead, they want to intimidate our community. Alex Rifchin says that Ed Husic should reconsider his support for these misguided bully tactics, because that's what we're seeing. We are seeing serious bullying of the Jewish community on the streets and on social media, and they do not discriminate against someone's age. It doesn't matter if they're a school child, if they're 13-year-old girls in their school uniform, or if they're adults. Well, joining me now to discuss, Sky News hosts Paul Murray and Liz Storer.
Hello, mate.
Welcome to you both. Liz, you know, what do you think about someone like Ed Husic who dresses this up as humanity with Gaza? We all care about innocent Palestinians just like we do about innocent Jews, but that's not what we're seeing unfold in Sydney and Melbourne and other major cities, not just in Australia, but globally.
And he's really playing the victim card really strongly here, because the 3 actors that he's referring to have not been disciplined. Nothing whatsoever have been done. They haven't lost their jobs. So him saying, oh, you know, people are being basically persecuted. No, we do have freedom of speech here. You did get to express yourself. Unfortunately, you did it while you were on the job, OK? So surgeons don't get to stop practising in the middle of a surgery. Lawyers don't get to stand in court and be like, well, actually, I'm just going to unfurl the Palestinian flag right now. No, you're on your employer's time, and that's why there was such an outrage over the Sydney Theatre Company furore. But those actors themselves have not been persecuted in any way. They got to express themselves. They're sailing on free. The journalists that you've already touched on, obviously that is part of journalistic integrity. They weren't stood down in any way. They were simply taken, oh, you've revealed a bias, we're taking you off those particular stories. That's all fair.
And that's only at the Herald, not even at the Guardian or anywhere else.
Exactly. So for him to then come out and call this the new McCarthyism, do me a favour. Like, that is an insult to the leftists of long ago who were genuinely persecuted. And you're right, to make this a bargaining chip about, oh, we're on the side of humanity and therefore you're now persecuting people for not remaining silent about it, it's just untrue.
And in fact, we're seeing the opposite. Not only are people not being disciplined, but people who break the law aren't being charged. People who seriously break the law on the streets with hateful protests, you know, at the Crown Plaza Hotel, no one is being charged.
Not a
here,
single arrest.
even if it's clear violation of hate speech laws. But Paul, you know, Australians are sick of people who have nothing to do with this, doctors, school teachers deciding to protest, take kids out of school. And what we're seeing here is a member of the Albanese government front bench actually encourage this type of behaviour.
Yeah, what I find, I mean, look, we're all going to be on a unity ticket about being close to free speech absolutists. The problem with this situation is that we have seen in the past couple of years that if someone decided to use their job to speak against what the prevailing logic was at the time, well, they either got sacked, cancelled, not invited back. You know, it's pretty obvious what people happen if you were in the wrong place on the COVID narrative, right?
Yeah.
I would like to see a free speech country that turns around and sees a scenario where if the actors want to say something, then the Jewish audience member can stand up and scream back. Nothing happens to either. But we know what would happen, which was that the audience member, if they stood up, would be banned and never allowed to return to the theatre again. But equally so, we don't live in a free speech absolutist society. We have a society that makes, quite understandably, a series of things that are acceptable and not acceptable. Wearing the garb or screaming the chants of the people who went and killed on October the 7th, just because it's December 7, January 7 or February 7, doesn't mean it is not as offensive as it was on October 8 when the terms were being screamed out the front of the Opera House. But as you know, that now is up for debate. If you turn around and say what you heard, what you saw on that tape, oh, now that's in dispute. What you are seeing here is the multifaceted way that people are able to gaslight you about what you can see with your own eyes for very obvious reasons. We all know the obvious and technical differences between Israel as a state and Jews as people around the world, right? We know the difference. But when you turn around and you write on a school kid's cricket net that Israel equals genocide, and it's one that's used by Jewish schools, it's pretty obvious what message you're trying to send and whom you're trying to send it to.
And keeping this seed of doubt afloat in the unthinking minds of just the mass public, say, who aren't obviously across it every day like we have been since that fateful day. Keep sowing those seeds of doubt. That seems to be the play of people who are pro-Palestinian. They're marching. They've got front benches now. It's not just Ed Husic, it's Anne Ali. It's the fact that neither of them have been condemned. We've got journos now speaking out saying, I wrote an article for Channel 9 and they said, no, you can't say that part about the sexual violence because, you know, we don't have these reports verified, much like the ABC reporter we were talking about weeks and weeks ago who'd said the same thing about beheading babies. Oh, it's BS, he'd said in that text thread. This seems to be a ploy if we can just sow enough doubt in people's minds that what Israel's doing is uncalled for and therefore unconscionable. And have you really been told the truth about what happened on October 7? That is the implication. It is evil and downright wrong, but I think that's the play because we seem to keep seeing it play out.
I think, Paul, you know, your mention of the word gaslight really resonates with me because that's what it feels like. It's this constant gaslighting. Oh, no, we weren't saying gas the Jews, kill the Jews. We've heard the tapes. You know, it's this constant thing. And, you know, this idea of, yes, you can criticise Israel. Of course, you can criticise any government. But what we're seeing here, and, you know, I'm going to come back to this probably tomorrow night, but is that there's very high-profile people on social media who are now banning Zionists from their podcasts, banning Zionists from their platforms. I'm sorry, but the majority of Jews support the existence of a Jewish homeland of the State of Israel. And so it's not embarrassing to be a Zionist. Everyone should be proud to support the State of Israel, to be proud to be Zionist. It doesn't mean that the government's not is perfect, just like in Australia. We love Australia, we're patriotic. Of course, the government's not perfect. We sit here every night and criticise it, as we're about to in a second when we get to Labor's misinformation laws. Paul, you're nodding away.
Yeah, no, I'm nodding away because, again, I sound like a broken record, but whenever we talk about this, what is heartbreaking is how insightful this is about how uneven the system works, right? Where what you would think would be that any sort of minority is taken care of by the wider Australian society. No, now there's hierarchies of minorities. Now there's hierarchies of people whom it is acceptable to rip into and acceptable and of course, totally beyond reproach. The idea that today, there's some footage of a Sydney train with, again, somebody doing the river to the sea thing over the speaker system. Now, again, my simple position is when you, as you say, you're on somebody else's dollar and you turn around and try to make something political, let alone something that provocative, well, then formal warning, right? Like in the same way, they're not just yelling out, go Tigers, they're saying something pretty aggressive. And in the same way that if somebody was doing white power chants over the sound system, you would expect some level of response.
But there
Instead,
would be
nothing
action
will
for
happen.
that. But there would be action if it was a white supremacist chant. Look, we've only got a minute or two left, but I just want to get to Labor's misinformation laws. So this extraordinary story that came out in The Australian today, that Michelle Rowland says she's going to have the power to direct ACMA, this is the media watchdog, to investigate instances of online misinformation. Wow. This is under their new legislation. I mean, Liz, this is unbelievable because this can be a minister deciding what she thinks is misinformation, what she thinks should be investigated. And you look at the myriad of things that the Albanese government has called misinformation this year.
100%. Or in the last 3 years, we saw this during the pandemic. Now, a lot of people have egg on their faces and going, so much of that misinformation turned out to be far truer than whatever narrative they were selling us at the time. This is straight out of George Orwell's 1984. The party is always right. How on earth, and God forbid this actually eventuates, that we end up with a government who gets to tell us what is acceptable to believe, what ideas are acceptable to be exposed to. You're not even allowed to think them, so we've got to make sure they don't reach your ears in case you adopt them. It's just unthinkable. That is when a free democracy ends.
And Paul, this was a problem as well under the coalition. Remember, a lot of the censorship about the COVID pandemic and discussion around vaccines and mandates and the origin of COVID, that was all censored, taken down by the Home Affairs Department in the coalition government. Yeah,
again, one of the reasons why, and what is the difference between a first world country and a third world country in many ways is the restraint of government. Right? Obviously, government can pass whatever law it wants to. It's got a path through the upper house thanks to Dormont Dave Pocock and the Greens, which means they can pass whatever law they want. But there are certain laws that you just don't go near because your political opponent at one point will be empowered to be able to use them.
Sure.
So while all of these people might be saying, it's great because it's going to be a way to go after all those no voters, all those people who share stories that appear from this channel, well, dare I say, God forbid, if your political opponent changes and they're given the same power. This is unacceptable in a democracy, but I think we have to, sadly, start to deal with the idea that the Greens and Pocock will get it to happen because they're all on the same line of trying to knock out the people who are their political opponents. And of course, and also this is a change to the law that means basically, the minister can be sitting back, they'll watch Media Watch on a Monday night, they'll make a little song and dance about something taken either out of context or deliberately cut a certain way. They can pick up the phone, investigation underway, and we all know how those go.
Well, it just goes to show that none of those people actually belong in Parliament, because if they're making decisions based on the fact that they want to stick around for longer, not what's best for the country, not what's best for a free democracy, goodbye.
Liz Storer, Paul Murray, our last panel show for the year. But Paul,
Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah.
Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. We'll see you guys next year, but we'll see you tonight, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And Paul, of course, both of you are here all week, as am I.
Thanks, Shari.
Bye-bye.
Now, still to come, our bombshell recordings of Brittany Higgins' lawyer speaking about her testimony were subpoenaed in federal court today. We'll get the latest on how this unfolded from our reporter, Julia Bradley, including today's testimony from The Project about what the TV show did to verify a photograph of a bruise on Higgins' leg. That's after this break. Welcome back. Well, lawyers acting for Sky News were ordered to hand over the secret recording linked to Bruce Lohman's defamation trial, which we exclusively brought you on this show last night. That recording featured Brittany Higgins' fiancé David Shiraz and high-profile solicitor Leon Zweier discussing how she could respond to questions under oath. Sky News reporter Julia Bradley has been covering today's developments and joins us live from Sydney. Julia, thank you so much for your time. So Mr. Lohman's lawyers subpoenaed this recording from us today. Give us the detail about what happened in court.
Well, they did, Shari, and just within the last hour or so, the lawyers acting for Sky News have handed over that USB containing that secret audio recording to the federal court. This audio recording, of course, linked to Bruce Lohman's defamation trial, and the audio recording which you exclusively brought viewers last night on your program. Now, this audio recording was this morning subpoenaed by Mr. Lohman's lawyers, this exclusively obtained by Sky News. And as you told viewers on your program last night, this audio shows solicitor Leon Zweier discussing the case with Brittany Higgins' fiancé David Shiraz at the Park Hyatt hotel lobby on December 4, while Miss Higgins was still under cross-examination. The solicitor can be heard telling Mr. Shiraz, "She should say privilege, Your Honour. I'm told by my lawyer I don't have to discuss legal advice. That's what she should say." Now, the recordings were made by an unrelated party sitting in the public bar. Witnesses are not allowed to receive coaching during their period of cross-examination. This is something that's been repeatedly asserted by Justice Lee. If Mr. Zweier's advice was communicated to Ms Higgins, it would be a potential contempt of court. Sky News Australia, of course, does not suggest that Mr. Zweier intended his advice to be passed on to Ms Higgins, and there is no evidence that Mr. Shiraz did so. Now, Shari, during another explosive day of evidence in this defamation trial, the court was also played a secret phone call Ms Higgins recorded between herself, her former boss, Liberal Senator Michaelia Cash, and the Senator's Chief of Staff, Daniel Try, on February 5, 2021. The conversation occurred just a week after Ms Higgins spoke with journalist Lisa Wilkinson and her producer Angus Llewellyn prior to their 2021 story about her rape allegations being broadcast. This report is, of course, the subject of the defamation proceedings. Now, Ms Higgins has previously told the trial she believes Senator Cash was lying in that phone call about her knowledge of the alleged rape, claiming she had learned about it back in 2019. This is something Senator Cash's office has denied. During cross-examination and after hearing the audio, Mr Lohman's barrister, Matthew Richardson SC, suggested to Mr Llewellyn that he should have questioned Ms Higgins' claims.
Julia, the photograph of the bruise, Brittany Higgins' bruise, was again brought up during cross-examination today. Tell us what the project's producer said about the efforts he went to verify the authenticity of that photograph.
So this was brought up during the cross-examination of Mr Llewellyn today. It was Mr Lohman's lawyers who were pressing him on whether or not he took the appropriate steps to verify the credibility of this image. Now, this image has come up multiple times so far in this defamation trial. Mr Lohman's lawyers accusing Mr Llewellyn of having failed in his obligation to check the credibility. Now, this image of a bruise on Miss Higgins' leg, she claims she took it days after the alleged rape. During this trial, Ms Higgins admitted she couldn't be certain the bruise was sustained because of the alleged rape. The image which was provided to the project was a screenshot and not an original image. This amid claims from Ms Higgins that her phone had been wiped. Now, this was a key exchange between the pair today, Shari. Richardson SC said, "I want to suggest you failed in your obligations to check the credibility of the source and her evidence in respect to this photo." Mr Llewellyn replies, "I disagree with that. I suggest your conduct in relation to this photo was unreasonable." He replies, "I'd say to the contrary, I don't think I was unreasonable whatsoever." Now, Mr Llewellyn's cross-examination will continue tomorrow, after which time Network 10 will then call Lisa Wilkinson to give evidence. And Mr Lohman has always denied these rape allegations. Shari?
Right, Julia Bradley, thank you so much for that information. Now, in an exclusive story in the Australian newspaper today, we've learned that the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus was rushing to apply for a last-minute bid to supervise a released terrorist who wanted to attack the Federal Police headquarters and also refused to renounce violence in all contexts. The journalist who broke that story, Liam Mendes, joins me now. Liam, this is an extraordinary story you broke on the front page of The Australian today. So why was this terrorist released? What happened to actually let him out?
Thanks for having me, Shari. Well, this is the extraordinary thing, but at the end of the day, this Ibrahim Ghawazi's sentence expired, and it was there was no other choice than to let him out. He had finished his full sentence, and the Attorney General applied to the court with just 3 days' notice to have him placed under an interim supervision order, when normally these things are meant to be done up to a year before an offender's release.
I mean, this is what's so amazing. So you write today, the Attorney General was left scrambling to apply for an interim supervision order for the terrorist who planned to form an army at a Blue Mountains base and plotted to attack the headquarters of the AFP. So this is clearly a terrorist who had expressed quite violent intentions, but they were scrambling 3 days before he was released, rather than, as you say, months or even a year in advance. What has the government said about its poor handling of this case?
Well, we received a statement from them yesterday afternoon, and what they said was, at all times, the Attorney General applies for post-sentence orders in accordance with legislative framework. That's obviously completely wrong. To have made this application 3 days before the release of this very serious offender is extraordinary, considering he was locked up for 8 years. I don't quite understand how they didn't see this coming. There's really no explanation as to why they waited this long to apply for this interim supervision order.
And so what happens? He's now being supervised, but he can't be detained. Explain that to us.
Yes, that's right. So he's got 7 conditions that state where he can live, that he can't go near an airport or any other international form of departure. There's quite severe restrictions on who he can and can't communicate with, and different forms of communications. But to be completely honest, I've seen other interim supervision orders that are far more extensive. This one here, for this gentleman who has essentially threatened to blow up the Australian Federal Police headquarters, and he wanted to form his own army in the Blue Mountains. He was sentenced to 8 years in jail for this, and they've thought of applying for a supervision order 3 days beforehand, and they
Unbelievable.
Their excuse just didn't stack up for the judge as well in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, look, it looks like a massive failure. Liam Mendes, well done on your brilliant story again, and I'm sure you'll have more in the Australian tomorrow, so look forward to reading that.
Thanks, Shari.
Now, more evidence is emerging about how Hamas treated the hostages. It drugged, beat and sexually abused Israelis while they were being held hostage. And some of these details will be distressing, so a warning there. The Tel Aviv Medical Centre has received and treated 14 former hostages, among them a girl who was given horse tranquilizer for a few weeks. A few weeks of horse tranquilizer to a girl. This was during her time in captivity. Children were also reportedly drugged with what doctors believe were a class of sedative depressants similar to anti-anxiety medication like Valium, this in order to keep the children under control. We already know that children were threatened with rifles if they cried, and it's why the 9-year-old girl, Emily Hand, was too scared to speak above a whisper when she came home to her father. At least 10 Israeli civilians released by Hamas, both men and women, have also reported being sexually assaulted or abused in captivity. Others were tormented psychologically, forced to watch brutal videos of their family members being murdered. Others were kept in pitch black rooms for days at a time. There are believed to be around 137 Israelis still being held hostage by Hamas. Let's bring in now Israeli politician Sharon Haskell. Thank you so much for your time again. Look, this detail that we're learning about how innocent families were treated by Hamas, do you worry that particularly the children and the teenagers will take a very long time, if ever, to fully recover?
Absolutely. It's going to take a long time for them to recover, and they're going through rehabilitation at the moment, and they have an entire medical staff to support them here in Israel. They were abused, they were drugged, they were assaulted, they were forced to watch horrifying videos of Hamas butchering their families and their communities. Some of them were operated and really, really badly. One girl was operated by a veterinarian, causing damage to her arm. Another operation that was on a foot on one of the girls, they misplaced back the foot, and she had to go a few operations afterwards here in Israel afterwards. So, you know, the abuse that they went through there is really worrying, and we're looking forward to bringing them back. We understand that we have a time limit, and we are trying to reach them and to get to them as soon as possible and as quickly as possible. Yesterday, there were a few declarations of some Hamas leaders and some speeches that they say that they will not negotiate and they will not recognize Israel, and they'll continue to fight not just in the land of Israel, but also in the entire world. And that's worrying. We understand that we...
Yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. Look, you gave a very passionate speech. You've accused the United Nations Relief and Works Agency of encouraging the hatred of Jews. Can you take us through what you mean by these accusations against this United Nations agency?
Absolutely. I went to the European Union in Brussels to try and form a coalition to try and dismantle UNRWA. UNRWA is an agency of the United Nations that is dedicated only to perpetuate the conflict in Israel. It's dedicated only to continue to eternalize this Palestinian refugee status. And there's many issues with that agency. I want to take you a little bit back, because you need to understand that the definition of a Palestinian refugee is completely different to a refugee from anywhere else in the world. The Palestinian refugee is actually a status that you inherit. It means that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, even though they were never in the conflict, even though they were born somewhere else in the world, were raised there, and their parents were born somewhere else in the world and raised there, they still hold this status. And the reason why they want to hold this status is because it became some of a professional, and it's actually profitable to hold this status, because the United Nations is paying their welfare, their housing, their education. So who won't want to stay a Palestinian refugee forever, even their great-great-grandchildren? And that creates an issue when you look on Gaza. If you look on Gaza, 70% of the Gazan citizens are refugees. They are refugees in their own autonomy, on their own land, and their great-grandchildren who were born there, perpetuating this idea.
Yeah, and we know the figures as well that Palestinians in Gaza are one of the fastest growing populations in the world. Sharon Haskell, thank you so much for joining us once again today. I always appreciate your time in the program. And thank you so much for watching today. I'll be back at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and stay tuned because James Morrow will be filling in for Peter Credlin after the break, and he's got a great interview with David Coleman about those misinformation laws we spoke about earlier. See you tomorrow.